Hey, it's Mike. Welcome back to Fantasy Wargaming. This will be our first proper video with the channel, so let's um, start with a rather interesting topic. So we're going to be discussing the new season, the GHB 2022, and how we're going to approach starting this new season. So let's put our best foot forward and try and take advantage of the um, uneven landscape that's been created as a result of a lot of things changing. So, a couple of things to note here about the importance. Our aim is to try and pick one army and stick with it as long as we can. And the reason for that, for me personally, is I don't have the time or skill yet to just effortlessly swap between what is considered meta at the moment without effectively wasting the reps that I have for a given army. So what I mean by that is I'm not getting enough practice games in where I could just swap to whatever I consider great because I won't have the time really to gain the next point here, which is expertise. The longer that we spend with one army, the more familiar we become with the army, the less we're reliant on looking through the rules to remember what our possibilities are. And the more time that we can spend focusing on the bigger picture decisions that will help us actually win close games. And we give that up if we just constantly flip between one decision and another. So ideally, we want to try and pick something that is rather stable. And this is what comes to our next point about favouring third edition books. Because we can expect third edition books, and what I mean by that is armies that already have a book this edition, they will remain mostly static going forward. We don't have to worry about new releases changing the landscape, nor will we have to worry about significant amendments that may come in the form of battle scrolls. Another aspect of this is we need to look at what is notable about the current pack, um, everything that it entails, and try and help that inform our decision about which army we actually pick with, because that will help us gain momentum early on. So the three main points I would pick out when looking at the new pack is one, monsters are less important, but they are arguably more playable. And what I mean by that is because Hunters of the Heartland is gone, and because we don't have to worry about bonus points being given up for killing a monster, suddenly monsters become more appealing because we don't have to worry about those concerns. We can guarantee that our monstrous rampages are more likely to be successful on the units that we need them to be successful against. And we can be sure that we're not bleeding victory points just for including one in our army. So ideally, the army that we pick would have some flexible and useful monsters as part of its roster. The second point is that Galician veterans are either garbage or vital depending on who you ask. So what I mean by that is there's been much discussion within the community about how bounty hunters affect the viability of Galician veterans. For those not aware, Galician veterans are battle line that have 4 wounds or less, and they're not mounted. And there's a whole lot of different aspects of the battle pack that key off of that keyword. Some people seem to think that bounty hunters gaining bonus damage against them makes them somewhat of a liability, as does some battle tactics giving you a bonus point for killing a Galician veteran. Likewise, so does that one battle plan that I forget the name of, which gains you 2 or 3 victory points just for killing one. A complete Galician veterans unit limits. I tend to err on the side of I think they're going to be quite important. I think that perhaps their importance has been rather downplayed right now because people don't have a fantastic amount of experience with the new battle pack, and they just look at the insane effect that the bounty hunters battalion gives and thinks, oh well, let's just not worry about Galician veterans. I think that including them is it's not going to be an automatic choice for every army. I think some armies can get away with simply not taking them. But I think if you've got a strong Galician veteran candidate within your roster, I think it would be a mistake for you to simply overlook it just because of the presence of the Bounty Hunter Battalion. And the last point about the new pack is that the battle tactics have generally become more interactive. There are far less passive castle style battle tactics that someone can score automatically through passive gameplay. And what that means is the importance of being able to project out power in order to score these battle tactics becomes quite important. There's still some discussion within the community at the moment about whether they're easier or not. I tend to think they're a little bit harder, not significantly, but a little bit. But even if we accept as truth that they are about as easy as the last ones were, because they require more interaction, we ideally want to have mobile, flexible units that help us make sure that we can take advantage of those opportunities to score them. So then, given what we've just discussed, that is to say, what our ideal selection criteria for an army are, as well as what is notable about the new battle pack, what do I pick from my various armies that I have collected at the moment? I don't have the time at the moment to paint up an entirely new army, so I wanted to pick something that I already had mostly ready to go. And I decided, in my wisdom of foolishness, that I was going to leave that decision up to the community. So let's quickly run through each of the 4 candidates that I gave in my Twitter poll. I ran for 24 hours. I didn't want it to go on too long. And kind of view them through the lens of how do they stack up with our criteria. Basically, what we see as notable in the new battle pack. First off, we have Big War. So that's the army I was primarily playing in the last season. I have a lot of expertise with using them. I'm the second ranked global player with them for the last season. In terms of strengths, they have a huge toolbox element that allows me to be flexible. They have quite good Galician veteran candidates in Brutes and Ardboys. They have quite a roster of monsters, be it the Maw Crusher, the Sludge Raker, Gobsprak, and so on. However, they are quite liable to getting crushed by strong bounty hunter units because of that same strength that we were discussing with their Galician veterans. That makes them weak to bounty hunters. Now, there's ways around that. You could go minimum 3x5 Ardboys and then stock up on Glow Grunters as your sort of hammer of choice. But I'm not sure that that makes Big War a better army. I just think it makes a rather different one. But still, I think of the 4 choices here, it's one of the stronger ones. We have Nighthorn, which I don't have a fantastic amount of experience with for the new book. I played them primarily in 2nd edition, and back then they were quite weak and they were a very different feeling army. Now they're very strong. I would consider them to be a top tier army right now. They have great Galician veteran units. They have access to the Krulgas Cruciator that makes them less susceptible to bounty hunters than other armies. And they can project power quite well because of their mobility, though they do lack in ranged output. We have Dave Sedatnus, aka Slave Sedatnus. I was actually putting together quite an interesting Kabbalists list that was going to try and take advantage of the strength of Purple Sun and combining it with the ability of Kabbalists' armies to move a illness spell twice in Aero phase, which is quite interesting. In terms of how they play into the current battle pack, they have good bounty hunter options in Vanguard. They have decent, okay Galician veteran candidates in Iron Golems, Untamed Beasts, and so on. They project power okay. They are quite reliant on a teleport spell going off in order to really get mobile, but they're still quite strong. And their monsters are fairly mediocre outside of Archaeon. And then I just want to say before we move on to KRULEBOYZ, Slaves of Darkness was sort of an afterthought. I decided to include them because I felt like three choices was too few, and I did technically have an army painted up, but I was completely out of practice with them. And finally, we have the KRULEBOYZ, which was my probably my personal favorite of the four, just because I love the models. I think the aesthetic of Swamp Hawks is quite cool. However, they were by far the weakest of the four factions that I was looking at here. They have terrible Galician veteran units. They don't really have fantastic bounty hunter options. They have gut rippers, but they're so mediocre in terms of survivability that they're not going to stick around long enough to really take advantage of that. That said, they can project power very well because their bolt boys are fantastic at killing units at range. And their monsters are some of the stronger monsters currently available in the game, I feel. Though they do have weaknesses, they mostly being their toughness. So before we actually get to the results, I wanted to thank the community for taking the time to actually think about it. Although I suspect that some people were voting more for what they thought would be the most amusing outcome rather than what was perhaps the strongest outcome. My expectation was it was going to come down to Big War and Nighthaunt. Big War because that was the army I was known for, and Nighthaunt because that was one of the stronger armies in the game right now. Or at least I think those were the two armies I was kind of thinking if I land one of those two, I'm going to be in a good spot because if it's Big War, I'm familiar with them. If it's Nighthaunt, I'm dealing with quite a strong book. Slaves of Darkness, as I already mentioned, was a bit of an afterthought, and KRULEBOYZ I was a little bit worried about because I brought them to several tournaments in the last season. I felt that they had somewhat defined weaknesses that made them not really a good candidate to go 4-1 or better. But they did receive a recent slight buff in that with a recent battle scroll, Grinning Blade subfaction, the ability that they had, which was models can't shoot at Grinning Blade units if they're outside of 12 inches. That got buffed from only affecting the first battle round to affecting all 5 battle rounds, which makes it quite an interesting counter meta pick because it's good against very ranged heavy armies, and it helps shore up some of their durability issues that we'll talk about more in either another video or later on. So, spoiler alert: the results were KRULEBOYZ won. It was fairly close. Throughout the day of votes, I think all 4 armies took the lead at one point or another, and it was only sort of in the last 6 hours that it came down to 2 candidates. KRULEBOYZ received 33% of the votes. They got 50 out of 150 votes. Then came Slaves of Darkness. Then came Big War, and Nighthaunt was last place. Which, as we were talking about my expectations, like because I kind of hoped it was Big War or Nighthaunt, when I quickly realized that it was going to be KRULEBOYZ or Slaves of Darkness, I started to panic a little bit, if only because I'm getting thrown outside of my comfort zone. What actually happened was KRULEBOYZ got picked. So, thank you, Internet. Life is pain. You decided in your infinite wisdom to give me by far the weakest of the 4 options that I presented. Well, that's on me. That was my fault for even presenting them in the first place, and I think secretly I quite like the challenge that comes along with playing what I would consider to be one of the weakest armies in the game looking at this new season. So now that we've decided what we're going to start the new season playing, I think that we should round out this video by discussing KRULEBOYZ from a broad perspective, like what are their strengths and weaknesses, as well as what my initial thoughts are in terms of a list to playtest with ahead of Mancunian Carnage Summer Edition that's happening next month. So you'll see I've put some bullet points up there just talking about the sort of their strengths and weaknesses. Strength, high damage output army, and the quality of it is high because it's primarily coming from mortal wounds. Like their non-mortal wound output is fairly low. You don't really have much rend outside of rend 1 at best. The Maya Brute has rend 2, but you can't fill your army with Maya Brutes. That said, mortal wounds are one of the best sources of damage in the game because they get around so many different things. They're great against Ethereal. They're great against the save stacking metagame, and Bolt Boys being able to project that power without needing to get into combat is fantastic. Bolt Boys, if left alive, can do an appalling amount of damage. Weakness, they have poor mobility. They have no cavalry units that aren't heroes. And what that means is your sort of core castle is quite rigid and you're very reliant on your heroes to sort of do things like snatch enemy backfield objectives, unless you've somehow by some miracle done really well in the middle scrap and you've been able to push past that initial engagement. But generally you're looking at your vultures or sludrakers to sort of do what needs to be done on the periphery. They have some tricksy nonsense. It's not quite as reliable or potent as other armies bullshit, but they do have some tricks up their sleeve that other armies don't have access to. A couple notable ones being, one, they have a command trait that lets them redeploy a unit before the battle begins anywhere on the board outside of 9 inches of enemy units, which is very good for things like presenting a Maya Brute in your opponent's face turn 1, or putting a unit of 6 Bolt Boys into position so that they can move up and do a double volley if you were to take first turn. They could also potentially kidnap opposing units that aren't reinforced, but it's reliant on a 4-up followed by a dice roll that's higher than the unit that you are picking's wound characteristic, which I basically just said a bunch of words there. Essentially what it means is it's not terribly reliable. They have a few other odds and ends like rerollable redeploys from Gobsprak. Some tricks, not a ton though. Another weakness is their tissue paper durability. They have 2 heroes that can get up to a 3-up save, but neither one of them are particularly compelling. The entire rest of the army, you're looking at a 4-up save at best, and their line infantry a 5-up save at best, with their best battle line option being a 6-up save. And I believe only one unit in the entire army has a ward save, that being Gobsprak with a 6-up ward. What this means is that when we get charged, we can expect to lose units. We don't trade. We can trade, but our units aren't terribly efficient. And when we get our core pieces charged, they are quite likely to die unless we roll very well for saves. And the last core point about KRULEBOYZ is they have a fantastic spell lore. It's probably one of the top 5 spell lores in the game. All 4 spells are very playable. All 4 spells can have a significant impact on the game, and they play into what I was discussing with Tricksy Nonsense. You can shut off wards, you can move a KRULEBOYZ monster in the hero phase, you can shut off running for your opponent's units in an AoE and reduce their attacks characteristic by 1 to a minimum of 1 by affected units, which is an amazing spell. That said, this strength itself has an inherent weakness, which is our actual spellcasters who cast these spells are a bit crap. You have no native casting bonuses in the book. You have no native rerolls in the book. You are looking at rolling dice and hoping to get 7 or better because most of those spells are CV7. You can mitigate that somewhat by running cogs or bringing an incarnate to get a +1 to your casting bonus. But I'm not sure how strong that really is. So you're relying on coin flips to getting your spells off. And if you try and take advantage of that spell lore in a spell domination metagame, let's say there are mega casters going around, you have to accept that your pathway to victory likely doesn't include getting those spells off. So then, we've talked about KRULEBOYZ from a broad perspective, and as I see things, looking at those strengths and weaknesses, we have two real pathways to success. We can either go low drop, ideally aiming for between 1 and 3 drops, in order to leverage the strength of the new and improved Grinning Blade's subfaction ability to give away first turn and not really get shot at. Because there are some units that will be able to get within 12 inches turn 1. The likelihood is they wouldn't be able to shoot at our, in a castle. They'd just be shooting at like Hobgrots in front. And that way we can A, make sure that we control the proving ground, and B, make sure that we're insulated against an early double turn, which will, from experience, completely ruin KRULEBOYZ. So for that, we need to rely on primarily battle regiments, which means giving up on Warlord, it means giving up on Bounty Hunters, it means giving up on Expert Conquerors. But as I talked about earlier in the video, we don't have fantastic Bounty Hunter options, and our Expert Conquerors options aren't that great either. You're looking at Hobgrots or Gut Rippers, 6-up save or a 5-up save, not really going to happen in a world where Bounty Hunters exist. Our other choice is we utilize the new battalions, that being Expert Conquerors and Bounty Hunters, to try and lean into some of our strengths. So earlier I talked about how we actually have quite high damage output. The mortal wounds that get inflicted on hit rolls of 6, they are based off the damage characteristic. So what that means is if you put a Gut Ripper unit in a Bounty Hunter battalion, suddenly a 6 to hit will do 2 mortal wounds. If you're near a Sludge Raker, a 6 to hit will do 3 mortal wounds. That being against specifically an enemy Galician veteran unit. But that is very good when you consider that a unit of 10 is throwing out 21 attacks. Because suddenly 6 of those, or a third of those, if they've got the poison buff, are doing 2 to 3 mortal wounds. That's quite high. However, as you kind of guessed from how I've been discussing this, I don't really think that this is a viable strategy, because neither the Hobgrots or the Gut Rippers, our 2 candidates for Galician veterans or Bounty Hunters, are really going to stick around long enough to make good use of those battalions. So we've decided to lean towards the battle regiments where possible. And that brings us to our initial list. This is not the list that I'm planning on submitting to Carnage. Or at least I'll be surprised if it is. This is simply the first list that I'm going to be playtesting. I'm going to give feedback on it on a future video when I do decide what my inevitable list is. And I'll just kind of talk about where my head was at when I made these initial decisions. So let's get a few core points out of the way. I don't think that KRULEBOYZ is particularly playable unless you have a Sludge Raker, because the Sludge Raker's damage buff for mortal wounds is great, and the Sludge Raker itself is a very good on-rate monster. Gives us monstrous rampages, it gives us high damage output from hit rolls of 6, because 3 of its 4 profiles all have mortal wounds on 6s to hit. And it's quite mobile. We have Gobsprak, the Mouth of Mork. He is a model and unit that's near and dear to my heart. I think that he sings in Big War, but he's okay in KRULEBOYZ, because you don't rely on his spellcasting nearly as much in KRULEBOYZ. However, that re-rollable redeploy that he can give out is great with Grinning Blades, because you can put someone in a position where they have to engage us in order to clear away the screen to shoot at the stuff behind, but we can make those charges significantly more difficult, because they either stay outside of 9 inches, in which case looking at a 9 at best to make the charge, or they come within 9 inches and we can roll a dice to redeploy and potentially re-roll it because of Gobsprak, and potentially push them out of charge range altogether, which is great. I've used it to wonderful effect. It synergizes really well with Grinning Blades. Our other two heroes are a Swamp Caller, who's just giving out poison buffs primarily. He's very rarely going to be casting a spell. And a Breaker Boss on my Brute Troggoth with the Arcane Tome, Fasten Mount Trait, and Flaming Weapon. So Flaming Weapon is there to make his damage-free club damage 4. If you're not aware of what a Breaker Boss is capable of, it's just a lot of damage. He can have potentially up to 10, with Flaming Weapon that is, 10 damage 4 rend 2 attacks, which is amazing. And he also has 5 of the Bide and Goad attacks, which are freeze, 5 attacks, freeze, no rend, 2 damage. But they do mortal wounds on 6s. And if the nearest Sidge Raker, that mortal wound on 6 would do 3 damage instead. And Fasten is there to help mitigate their low speed, because they're 5-inch base move. So here we can either double tap a movement, and because the movement is in the hero phase, it synergizes quite well with the command trait we gave our Sludge Raker, which is super sneaky. I mentioned it earlier, this lets us redeploy one of our units before the game begins anywhere on the board outside of 9 inches. What we can do is, let's say that we outdrop our opponent and we have the option to go first. We can pull the Breaker Boss from wherever it is and put it 9 inches away from our opponent. We can take the first turn. We can use Fasten in the hero phase to move 5 inches to get 4 inches away. And because we do it in the hero phase, there's no opportunity to redeploy. And then have a very, very achievable charge. Or, if our opponent has not screened adequately, we could do the same thing that we were just discussing, but we could also move in the movement phase. So then he starts out 9 inches away, moves 5, moves another 5, and could potentially charge around the back of the screen and try and hit those support heroes. And yes, we give up control of the Proving Ground and we make ourselves vulnerable to a double turn, but we would only take this opportunity if we were up against an army that would not deal well with a very strong combat hero in their deployment zone turn 1. And if we don't take advantage of that opportunity, it's still a very good on-rate hero who can make his points back and more. People continuously underestimate the Maya Brute, and even if he's not getting into combat, because he's got Arcane Tome, he can cast Mystic Shield, which is just a very good spell. The rest of our army, we've got 2x10 Gut Rippers, because we need Gut Rippers. I don't particularly love them, but they are our only unconditional battle line in Gritting Blades. And because we take 2 units of Gut Rippers, we also unlock the ability to take up to 2 units of Hobgrot Slitters as battle line. But you'll note here, I've only made one of them battle line and the other one is not. The reason for that is we do not really need to give the second unit of Hobgrot Slitters battle line, because if we do, it makes them weak against bounty hunters and it potentially lets us bleed even more victory points on that one battle plan that awards bonus points for killing GVs. The trade-off here is that they could not contest the Proving Ground, but the chances are Hobgrot Slitters are going to die anyway. And this way, at least I've got one of my 2 cheap screens. I don't have to worry about giving up certain battle tactics or bleeding victory points for its inclusion. And our unit roster is rounded out by the unit 6 Bolt Boys and 2 units of 3 Bolt Boys. So the unit of 6 is probably going to be receiving the poison buff from the Swamp Caller, and then I have 2 units of 3 Bolt Boys who are, if I'm not giving the poison buff to a unit, it's more efficient to go MSU, because A, you get 1 extra champion attack for each MSU unit you're running over combining them into 1 unit. But B also means that you make your opponent's shooting worse, because they're either splitting shots, because most ranged Death Stars are just that. They're like a 15-man, 20-man, 30-man unit, and it's the only real range threat in the army. If you can make them have to split their shots, you can potentially end up saving the unit, and it gives you more flexibility in terms of positioning I just think it's better than having 2 units of 6 who can get their asses absolutely kicked by any incidental shooting. Like, for example, sharks, who have got the movement speed to get within 12 inches and have more than enough damage output to kill a unit of 6 Bolt Boys. And then finally, we have Chronomatic Cogs and Purple Sun. Chronomatic Cogs is there to help make our spellcasting more reliable, and Purple Sun is there because it is a very, very strong endless spell. I don't really need to give it too much mic time here because many other people have already talked at length about how good it is. But we're trying. We're in Grinning Blades. I've not decided what our grand strategy is, and we're taking it in 2 battle regiments, which leads us to a total of 3 drops. 3 drops because we have 3 heroes of 10 or more wounds. So that means that we're in that sweet spot of being mostly under the drops of armies that are taking both Expert Conquerors and Bounty Hunters, or Bounty Hunters and Warlord, or Bounty Hunters and Warlord in a battle regiment. So we can hopefully control the proving ground. Other options that we could have, and these are things that I'm kind of mulling over in my head. I could cut the Cogs and Purple Sun, because Purple Sun is a CV8 spell, run Shards of Valagar and Ravenous Smashing Jaws. If you're not aware, Shards has the movement of a unit, and then Jaws does mortal wound damage based off of the opponent's move characteristic. So they synergize really well. They're lower CV units, and it might end up being not a stronger in general endless spell combination, but stronger for what we're doing because we don't have any native casting bonuses, so we're not terribly consistent when it comes to putting the Purple Sun on the board. The other option I'm considering is just cutting Gobsprak altogether because of that weakness of not having any spellcasting buffs. This would give us points for either more Bolt Boys or a Vulture Boss, who's 40 points cheaper, and then we could take the 40 points, add on the 70 from the Purple Sun and the 40 from the Cogs. That gets us to 150. What could we do with that? We could potentially change around our Hogrots to add, say, cut 10 Hogrots and run another 6 Bolt Boys. I don't know. Probably if Gobsprak comes out, it kind of rewrites the whole list into sort of more of a Monster Mash list, where suddenly we're taking more than one Sludge Raker, we're cutting back the amount of range units we're having, and we're just going to rely on being sort of a damage output army. But I've got to get some game. I've played 1 game with the list. I'm quite happy with it as it stands right now, but I do have some thoughts. The biggest weakness as I see it is if we are in a spell domination meta, Cogs and Purple Sun isn't going to be great if we can't get those spells off when we're looking at like Nagash or Croak or other armies that have rerollable unbinds and bonuses to unbind. Like I've just realized another one. Thankwell is another mega caster that's just burst onto the scene. So I'm going to spend some time playing some games with it, and I will revisit this when it probably in a few weeks. This topic, that is, because that'll be when I'll actually have to commit to a army. I'll have to submit it for Mancunian Carnage. But this is what I'm looking at right now, and this is where we're going to leave off today's episode. If you have any thoughts about KRULEBOYZ, feel free to leave them in the comments. I'm happy to discuss KRULEBOYZ army construction at any time, be it on YouTube comments, or you can hit me up at LRUK or at FAM Wargaming, and we can talk about this or even just your thoughts on the current battle pack as a whole. I've not decided what my next video's topic is going to be. When I do so, I'll kind of give a heads up on Twitter. I'm probably leaning towards sort of a discussion on the spell domination meta that's currently seemingly coming forth, although that could change if I find a better topic to discuss. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.